Hello everyone, this video is for the Caro-Kann exchange variation, and this game I played against my opponent in a tournament in 2023. So this was an over-the-board tournament. As I mentioned before, for this playlist I tend to just have classical time control games, either online or over the board. So this was a nice game, and I know you guys liked the Caro-Kann video previously. So I just wanted to show another variant of or variation of that same opening with the black pieces. It tends to be that it's a little bit harder to play with black. Since white has the first move, it's a little bit easier to just stick to one opening, but with black we sometimes have to pick a couple openings depending on if our opponent starts with e4, d4, or maybe add another repertoire when our opponent shows up with something like c4 or knight f3 in move 1, right? So I know a lot of you like the Caro-Kann opening, so I hope this helps a little bit with some ideas that you can incorporate for your own repertoire, okay? So here my opponent started with e4, and my response was c6, the Caro-Kann. And I remember this tournament, I believe, was 1 hour each person, each player, and a 5-second delay. So every time you press the clock, or your opponent presses the clock, you have 5 seconds before your time starts running down, right? But you're not adding time to your clock, so you always have that timer of 5 seconds, and then you're not adding any time on top of that, right? So a little bit less useful than increment, but still you have the extra cushion of time that you can try to avoid flagging, right? It's hard to flag someone in over-the-board tournaments like this. So after d4, we go for the Caro-Kann, d5, and then my opponent goes for e takes d5, right? So the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, I take back, and then he goes straight away with c4. I just developed my knight. Some ideas here would probably be to just go e6, but a very common response, knight f6. And the idea of knight f6 is that you're developing a piece while also defending here, right? So if they were to capture, you can just capture back with the knight, and you're developing a minor piece instead of just pushing the pawns forward, right? So that's one of the ideas of this. So I just developed my knight, and my opponent also develops their knight, and then I just go e6. And this kind of looks like a Queen's Gambit decline without the e pawn, without the c pawn, right? Development, bishop f4, and some ideas would be, once you have bishop f4 here, that's a very active square for the bishop, and now it's targeting here at c7. So my opponent has some ideas of bringing here the knight to b5 and then going for a fork. It's very tough to stop it, right? So if we don't do anything about it, let's say we go h6, for example, if we go h6 here, my opponent has some ideas of maybe considering even moves like this, but I have to bring some check and try to deflect some pieces from my opponent's attack, right? So we have some ideas like that. But here I just decided to just trade the bishop. Takes. The knight jumps forward here. I could give a check here, queen b4 check, and then try to castle. Probably that would be the most appropriate idea, right? The most appropriate sequence. Very accurate, maybe check. If queen, I can just take, and then I just can castle or something. That would be a good idea, but I went for the second recommendation by the engine, which is queen d8. The most accurate would have been giving a check and then trying to go for a trade with castles right there. So here I just castle, and we can notice that the pawn here on c5, it's a very annoying pawn to deal with, and I should be targeting it right away. I didn't do that, and I should have. But first of all, I want to avoid any sacrifices and ideas later on. Although my knight here is an f6, so we're good. But just in case, h6, prophylactic move, always cutting some squares from the knight. And also having some air for my king. Not right now, because the bishop is obviously hitting that square. But here, my opponent just castles. Very good here. I went for a6, although the computer really likes, it screams for b6. And this is something that we have to consider in these positions, because if we go here, they might go here, and then we can try to go for this, and we can try to chop up some pawns, right? Because they have connected pawns, and then we have to play for e5 for 1 point to break the root pawn here, right? So if we go here at 1 point, we need to prepare it. We need to prepare it right now. Maybe not right now, but somehow we need to prepare this, like maybe rook here, and then go for e5 to get rid of this root pawn. That way the c pawn will be very weak at 1 point. But here I went kicking the knight out, but my opponent went forward. Good idea, but I just tried to trade the knights here. So I just go for this. My opponent takes my bishop, and I was wondering if it was better to capture the bishop or the knight. So here the computer is saying that it's just better to capture the knight, because the knight can always just come back here and then go for e5, or sorry, e4. And my opponent took the bishop, and you can think, okay, why the bishop, right? First of all, it's the second recommendation by the computer. Taking the bishop, the top engine move is just capturing the knight. And why would you think that the bishop is not a good target to capture right away? Just take a moment, you can pause the video and just take your time. So if you could give me a couple of reasons, or just one reason of why the bishop is not a good, or is just less good, I guess. It's not as good as capturing the knight. It's because all my pawns are in light squares. And I have a light square bishop. Also, I haven't even moved my bishop. So why would you even capture, right? Maybe you can think of, oh, later on the bishop you can activate the bishop. It's very hard to activate the bishop, actually. So here a better move would have been just capturing the knight, because the knight has better prospects, better squares. To be able to activate my bishop, I have to like go for e5, maybe bring it here at 1 point. It's hard. My bishop is just looking at my pawns. So, I mean, here my opponent just went to capture the bishop anyway, and then is trying to prepare a3 to go for this move, right? So here I just develop my queen, move a little bit, and I tried to go for knight f6. I have to go for these ideas, but I wasn't doing this back then. I should have. But here my opponent got too excited, I think, and went for b5. Wrong idea thing there, because now this pawn here on d4 is very weak. So I have ideas of maybe bringing my rook, maybe playing for e5, or maybe rook here first, then e5, and this c5 pawn is very weak, right? So here my opponent goes with the bishop. I bring my knight, maybe to have this move set up, and then I have always ideas of just defending my knight and things like that. Rook e1, I go with my rook on the open file, or not really open because there's a pawn, but already targeting this weak pawn here on a3. The queen here behind the bishop, and I just went back with the knight. I don't know why I went back with the knight, to be honest. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I should have gone rook b8 or something. Still, the computer screams, go b6, go b6, and I should have probably gone for that, to be honest. b6, if takes, I can capture with the knight, I can capture with the queen. Maybe with the queen is better, because if they capture my knight, I can just always capture this queen. So that would have been a better idea, but I didn't do it. I just went back with my knight because I was seeing the e4 square. It's a nice outpost there. My opponent captured my knight with the bishop, and after I captured with my pawn, my opponent did this move, queen b6, and this gave me a lot of advantage. And I was able to find the correct response here, just capturing the queen. And my opponent is trying to claim that he has a passed pawn, and he could try to defend it, maybe like this, and then maybe doubling up the rooks, maybe like this, 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 and then start pushing the pawn forward, and then at one point maybe bring the knight somehow, maybe like this, 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 and then push the pawn forward. But I thought I can just target it right away. He's not in time to push the pawn, right? Because if he pushes the pawn, I can just capture this pawn. So my opponent just went rook b1, well, rook e b1, and I just bring my knight. Now instead of bringing my knight forward, now I'm already targeting some weaknesses. Because if we try to assess the position right now, what's the biggest weakness, or what are the biggest weaknesses that the white position has? So we have the pawn on b6, we have a weakness here on a3, and the biggest weakness is actually d4. So if somehow we can just come here, the knight can never move really, right? Unless you just want to trade rooks or something, but that doesn't really work that much or that well. So here, my opponent goes for this move. So here I can try to just capture with my knight. I can actually just do that. I guess I can do that, but according to the engine, I only have to find one move that keeps advantage for the black pieces. If I don't find this move, it's advantage for the white pieces by a lot. Okay, and it is the move knight takes e5. And it's a little bit strange, right? Because you're saying, you may be thinking, oh, just capture the pawn, you're connecting all the pawns, you can have connect 4 pawns here for the white pieces, and you still have these 2 pawns to deal with, right? And now this d4 pawn is no longer a weakness, because you can always defend it with these pawns. But it's the most accurate move to keep the advantage for the black pieces with -2 almost. Here I just target the pawn with my other rook. There's no other way to defend it other than just pushing the pawn forward. And here I just bring my rook back. And now my opponent is losing this pawn for sure, right? Right now I will be, in this position, I will be like +1 point, meaning that I would have an extra pawn, right? So here my opponent goes, okay, you're gonna win my pawn, but I'll win your pawn. And if I try to go like this, maybe he will want to trade rooks or something. But here I capture. How will you capture in this position? Take some time to think. You can capture it a couple ways. But what would be the most accurate way to capture in this? You can try to capture it with the a rook, and you would double up. If your opponent captures here, you can try to go for this check. But then your opponent still has a passed pawn here, and you need to be careful, right? I capture it with my b rook this way. And the idea was that my opponent captured my pawn, but I can actually, in this position, sacrifice my rook like this. Rook takes a3. Brilliant move. It's not really brilliant, right? It's like that's the best move, just because my opponent cannot really capture my rook. What happens if my opponent captures my rook? Now I have checkmate, because here only move for the white pieces is to bring the rook back and then just be checkmated because of the background problem here, right? So here, even if they give me a check, I can just go back, and my opponent still cannot capture this rook because I would still have this checkmate here in this position. So here I'm still winning the pawn, and that was the right way to capture with the b rook, right? So after taking this pawn, my opponent just went with a battery of his own to try to give me some checks or stuff like that. And I just decided, you know what, I'll also create a battery of my own to trade these rooks. So right now, if he gives me a check or something, I can always just move. And if he does something like this to give some air for his king, I can always just trade the last rook, because the rook is pinned to the king. If the king moves, I'll capture this rook, or probably play other moves like g5 or so. But here I will be up a pawn. I will probably go g5 and then start bringing my king forward and targeting this e5 pawn, right? So here in this position, after the battery, my opponent went with g3 to, instead of bringing the king further away from the center, it would be going forward and also closer to the center. But here I just go with the rook b1 to trade one rook, right? So I trade one rook and I go with rook d7 to start pushing this d5 pawn forward for promotion, right? So I have an extra pawn, and by the time that my idea is to push the pawn all the way forward and then try to activate my king and try to eat some pawns here, like e5 and things like that. And if I try to capture this pawn by bringing my king to f5, if my opponent goes with a move like f4, I would have a move like g5 to then capture and then be closer to the pawns and try to grab some of white's pawns. So here, my opponent just went with the move f4, defending the e5 pawn. And I here try to attack the e5 pawn right away with f6, because if captures, my king can just go this way. And I always have ideas of just baiting the king like further away from the defense of these pawns, while my king just gets closer to these pawns to eat them, right? So that's the goal. And then my opponent here goes with rook c6, and I just take the pawn. My idea was like, if he were to capture here, maybe I can just push the pawn forward or something like that. Or maybe even capture, split their pawns, and I just start pushing this pawn forward, right? By the time this king gets here and I have my rook there, I can just try to activate my king or something. Ideas like that. So my opponent just captured, and now I bring my king to f7. And here, my opponent tries to cut some squares for my king, right? So his idea here would be to probably bring h4 right away. So here, I just start pushing my pawn forward. d4. If he goes for these ideas, I can always just push my pawn forward or something like that, or try to bring my king, maybe. My opponent starts bringing the king, and then I go d3. And here I was thinking, maybe it would have been better for my opponent to go with king f2 or something to meet this pawn with king e1. If I go forward, he can always have the king here on d1 or something, right? And my king is kind of stuck defending this e6 pawn, to be honest. But my opponent, instead of moving the king to f2, just went to f3. I think it was a little bit of a mistake, because now the position is -5 almost, -5 almost. And then my opponent goes with this move, rook d6. For rook d6, at the beginning, when my opponent played this move, I freaked out a little bit. My first reaction was like, oh, what do I do now? I was thinking that I couldn't capture this pawn, this rook, because after pawn takes, the pawn is covering here e7. So I thought that if I were to go around the pawn, he would be on time to defend or something. That was my initial reaction. But I took some time to think, and I said, okay, maybe here I just have to bring my king forward and then try to take so I can capture the pawn. And then by the time my opponent captures this pawn, I can try to get closer to this pawn and capture this one. So I'll be still up a pawn, right? And that will be winning anyway. And that's actually not a terrible idea. The second suggestion from the engine is actually just king e7, which is fine, or king e8. So those two ideas are fine. It's that's the second recommendation. This is the third recommendation. But the top engine move is what I played in the game. And I didn't really see the whole sequence. And sometimes you can be calculating some things and you don't see the whole picture, the complete picture. But as you make a move, then things become a little bit more clear. And that's what happened in this game. I captured the rook, and after I captured the pawn, I said, okay, I have to go around to capture this pawn, right? So if I go here, my opponent will probably go here. If I go here, captures, takes, comes here probably. And then I can probably bring my pawn forward, things like that. But after my opponent captured with the pawn, it became clear to me that I don't have to move my king in this position. So try to pause the video and think of what will be the move. And it would be a little bit obvious if I just said that you don't move the king, right? So you don't move any of the g pawns or h pawn or anything like that, but you just move the e pawn forward once. And what's the goal? What's the idea of this, right? What's the purpose? The purpose is that if my opponent were to go with king e4, I just push my pawn forward, and the king is too far from the pawn, and it cannot capture it back anymore, right? If my opponent gets closer here, like in the game, this is what happened. After my opponent played king e3, he didn't even think about this, but I just go forward with my pawn, my e pawn. I just push my e pawn forward, and now this pawn defends my d3 pawn, which means that my opponent cannot capture the e4 pawn. And if we were to capture here, I can just push my pawn forward, and the king is never in time to stop the promotion of the queen, of the pawn to a queen. So in the game, after I played this move, he got surprised. He didn't see this move. I don't know why. I didn't think of that move earlier. But it was a little bit crazy finding that move, and I was like, wait, that's just totally winning. That's it. That's the game, right? Because if he just pushes the pawn forward, here I can just go for the captures. And here he has to stall, right? He can never capture this pawn. I would probably eat this pawn, and whatever he does, I can just come here. And he cannot really move or do anything. If he goes there, maybe I can try to go for like king f6 and try to eat these pawns. Ideas like that. I could probably try to go here. Now if here he just goes to e3, repeats moves, it would just be better to just eat these pawns here and then start pushing this other pawn forward, right? Because the king will just do this maneuver just back and forth, e3, d2, e3, d2. So that's a nice idea for your games, right? Don't forget sometimes that yes, we're trying to activate our pieces, our minor pieces, things like that, but our pawns play a crucial role in winning the game sometimes. Sometimes this is a little bit tricky to see, right? To find in this move. Things like this, because we forget that our little pieces, the pawns, or we're just always trying to work with the queen and like the strongest pieces, but then like we forget that we need to involve more of our pieces, not just the strongest ones. Sorry, not just the strongest ones, but also the little pawns. The little pawns can become queens. So I hope you like this video. I hope you can get some ideas for your own games. Things like this, for example, simple things like this that can help you win some of your games in online games and also tournaments over the board. Don't forget to like the video, comment on the video. I always respond to the comments. If you have any questions from any questions in video or in general, you can just put it on the comments in this comment section below. I'll respond to it right away. And share if you like this video, share it with someone, you know, a friend, your dad, your siblings, and subscribe to the channel. That helps a lot, and I'll keep the videos coming. Okay, so I hope you have a great evening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.